All right, I think we'll get started. So my name is Dan Morehouse. I'm the broiler product manager here with Chore-Time, and today I'm going to give a short presentation on how to eliminate supplemental feeding using a feeder like our KONAVI feeder. So first, a little bit about me. I started with Chore-Time in 2017. From 2017 until 2021, I was a product engineer, primarily over the floor feeding product line. And in that role, I worked on product development for some of our products, product line maintenance as well, and also assisted on different projects throughout other product lines like ventilation. And then in 2021, I moved into the product manager role where I determined market trends, talk to customers and distributors, understand what those needs are going to be for our products, and how do we translate that into viable products, work on driving new product development, and manage the product line portfolio for the broilers. So an agenda for the meeting, I'll give a little bit of a background on brooding, background on supplemental feeding, some of the additional costs we see with supplemental feeding, how we're going to eliminate supplemental feeding using whole house brooding, timing the change to whole house brooding, and then a short summary. So first, the background on brooding. Brooding is the early growth period right after hatching. It's an extremely important period. You want to make sure you get it right. The birds need to have access to feed, water, and proper environmental conditions in order for it to be successful. And when you do properly brood your birds, you can expect higher daily average weight gains, improved feed conversion ratios, lower mortality, better overall bird efficiency. Background on supplemental feeding. So in order to understand supplemental feeding, you need to understand partial house brooding. So what partial house brooding is when you take your house and you partition it off and only brood your birds in a portion of that house. And a lot of the times, they'll use a curtain or something to separate the house. The intention here is if you're only brooding and have birds in half of your house, you only need to heat half of your house. So the thought is you'll reduce your heating costs, but as I go through some of my presentation, you'll see you really don't necessarily get all the savings that you think you might. So partial house brooding also leads to a lack of feeder space because you design a house for the entire house to be used, and then you partition half of that house out, so some of the feeders will not be accessible to the birds. And this is where supplemental feeding comes in. Obviously, you need to figure out a way to make sure that the birds have enough access to feed from day one. So some of the additional costs with this supplemental feeding. Obviously, the cost of the trays, the paper, removable feeders, there's a cost associated with this, and it's a reoccurring cost. Also, the labor associated with this. So you have to place the trays before each flock, take them out each flock, either wash them down, and if you have one house, that may not be a big deal, but when you start talking about 12 house farms or complexes, this starts to become a huge labor cost. And it's disruptive to the birds. If someone came in and took your feed away a couple days in, you'd probably be a little bit nervous and wonder what was going on. So if we can avoid these costs, that's something that we like to do. Some additional costs of partial house brooding and supplemental feeding. The distribution of the birds, obviously, if you take them and put them all in one portion of the house, is going to lead to uneven moisture levels in your litter. And when this happens, you get a spike in ammonia. And when you have a spike in ammonia, you have to look at your minimum vent schedule and probably increase that. And that's going to lead to, especially during colder months, some high costs. And this is one of those things that may offset the savings you think you're going to be getting when only heating part of the house if you have to increase your min vent program at the beginning of the flock. And obviously, you can see from this picture, feed cleanliness is less than ideal versus using something like a pan. So eliminating supplemental feeding, moving to whole house brooding. So we know what partial house brooding is. Whole house brooding, pretty obviously, is when you use the entire house to brood the birds. This is very common in Europe, Canada, and actually we're starting to see it become more and more common in the United States because you don't have the additional costs associated with the supplemental feeding. The extra labor costs go away associated with supplemental feeding. And with animal welfare concerns being more and more prominent, giving the space, more space to the birds, more access to clean feed is more and more important. So things to consider when you're moving from partial house brooding to whole house brooding. Adequate feeder space. This is the whole reason we have supplemental feeding. When you have birds in half the house and you eliminate most of the feeders, you need to make sure that they have adequate feeder, access to feed and feeder space. So if you move to whole house brooding, eliminating supplemental feeding, one of the things you may have to do is add an extra feed line in your house, and that is going to be an upfront cost, but it's a one-time upfront cost versus the reoccurring costs associated with supplemental feeding, such as the trays, the labor, and additional potential to have a higher min-vent schedule. You want to keep the feed fresh and clean. As you can see here, this is a great depiction of our KONAVI feeder versus one of our older legacy feeders. With a grillless feeder, none of the birds are getting into that pan, or as you saw in the other picture where birds were crawling through the paper, walking in the feed. So your feed is going to be a lot cleaner. You're going to have less disease issues. As well as with the grillless feeder design, you can see all the birds are going to be eating outside the perimeter of the feeder, and that entire perimeter of the feeder is available feeding space. When you look at this legacy feeder over here, when you have birds inside, that's no longer feeder space that the birds can get to, which can lead to some issues throughout the flock. Additional considerations, easy access to feed from day one. This is very important when you're choosing the pan to make sure that it's a pan with a low pan height. This KONAVI pan has a pan height very similar to the lip of the trays that you see in our trash the trays dumpster over there. And when you move to a pan like this, you can expect improved feed conversions because you're not going to have the waste inherent with supplemental feeding, as well as anticipate lower mortality when you use a feeder like this because birds won't get stuck in the feeder. As I mentioned, disease control is going to be easier when you have cleaner feed, and feed space is readily available, so birds will always have access to the clean feed. So I convinced you to move to whole house brooding. How are we going to time this change? So as I mentioned, the industry is already moving in this direction quite rapidly. We have large retailers and restaurants that are encouraging people to move towards better animal welfare practices, such as giving more space to the birds in the house, more space for them to move around, more feeder space available, and the clean feed, which we really think we accomplished with our KONAVI feeder. And making the change to whole house brooding at the same time as you make the change to eliminating supplemental feeding is the perfect combination. So here's a little chart about how partial house brooding and whole house brooding kind of compare in a couple different key areas. On the left here, you can see the supplemental feeding. You have to have that because of the lack of available feeder space, and there's an extra labor and physical capital cost to getting these things every flock. With whole house brooding, you don't need the supplemental feeding equipment or the labor to deal with it. However, like I mentioned, you will have one upfront cost of potentially putting in an additional line to make sure you do have the adequate feeder space. In partial house brooding, you have easy access to feed because you have the trays and the feed is just laid out there for the birds, which, as I mentioned, is very important. In whole house brooding, as long as you use a feeder like the KONAVI that has that low pan height, you accomplish this as well as getting some of the benefits of cleaner feed and not having to deal with the supplemental feeding costs. One of the big things, this goes back to what I was mentioning where we have the partial house brooding where we believe that we're gaining some costs in heating since we only need to heat half the house, but these uneven litter moisture levels get additional litter caking, which can be problematic, and lead to the higher ammonia, which obviously you'll have to change your min-vent schedule, which can be costly. And then when you move to whole house brooding, since you spread those birds out over a wider space, you get even litter moisture levels, less cracking, and avoid the issues with the ammonia. And last, the pretty obvious one, the cost and labor, these add up when you're using supplemental feeding, house after house, flock after flock. When you have multiple houses, it becomes even a bigger problem, and you eliminate these costs and labor when you move to whole house brooding. So a summary, eliminating supplemental feeding can offset a lot of the expenses of moving to whole house brooding when you look at the fact that there's going to be less labor, less capital investment into trays and paper, less minimum vent costs, lower mortality, which is always great for the grower, and cleaner feed for the birds, which means less disease. So quickly wanted to go over our KONAVI broiler feeder, which we think is a great solution if you're looking at eliminating supplemental feeding and moving from partial house brooding to whole house brooding. So as I mentioned before, the low pan height is critical. You've seen some pictures throughout this presentation where the birds have easy access to feed. It keeps the birds out of the pan, which is also critical because the feed is going to be cleaner. And then it ensures the entire pan is, the circumference of that pan is accessible feed space to the birds because you're not going to have birds in one of like our legacy feeders getting inside that pan, dying in that pan, and then now you don't have that space available for some other birds to eat out of. And then we do have this in a robust two-piece top configuration, which means if you already have some houses, it's easy to retrofit these KONAVIs into those houses. And keeping with the KONAVI theme, new for 2023, we're releasing a pullet version of this KONAVI, all the same great benefits that we get with our broiler version, except for it's designed to hold less feed. Obviously, for pullet houses, you need less feed in the feeders to manage them properly. One unique feature about this feeder is also the capable to reflood. So if you accidentally take your feeders out of reflood too early, you're able to actually reflood those pans. So if you make a mistake, it's a little bit more forgiving. And then something that's really nice about this feeder is people are already comfortable setting up house layouts for legacy feeders like our C2 Plus. It's the same house layout, just with a feeder we think does the job a little bit better. So with that, I thank you guys for sitting here listening to the presentation. Please make sure you go over and try and guess how many trays we have in our dumpster to win a Yeti. And if you have any questions about supplemental feeding, whole house brooding, we have a whole team here at the booth that would be happy to talk to you. So thank you guys, and look forward to talking to you for the rest of the show.